Coast Business Radio is the home for business from the Gold Coast to Byron Bay and beyond. Whether you're an entrepreneur, small business owner, or just managing your family's assets, the Coast Business Radio podcast can help. Find the resources you need to manage your money, start your latest venture, grow your business, and be able to compete in a global market.
On Coast Business Radio, we catch up with Tim Mander, Deputy Leader of the Opposition and Shadow Treasurer, who talks up the LNP's big infrastructure projects to secure economic growth.
So that we can produce enormous amounts of hydroelectricity to power up to 800,000 homes. We can also irrigate a landmass the size of Tasmania with the water that'll be provided. We'll create thousands of jobs.
Dr. Ivan Misner, founder of BNI, the world's largest business networking organisation, says that if you wait until tough times are over, then your business will be over.
If you wait until tough times are over, your business will be over. And so you cannot wait until tough times are over. You have to really spend time now working on your business. And this is where I believe networking is an incredibly powerful tool.
The federal government has injected $50 million into manufacturing projects. We spoke with Karen Andrews about this government initiative.
There's 3 here on the Gold Coast that cover a wide range of areas. I was actually at Lena Broughton, one of our Australian fashion labels that manufactures right here on the Gold Coast. So they're one of the recipients.
Senator Malcolm Roberts from Pauline Hanson's One Nation says the role of government is one of the biggest stumbling blocks to economic prosperity.
What I believe is our biggest detraction at the moment from economics, a successful economy, is the role of government. Government has no longer serving the people. Instead, government has been reversed in its roles, and the people are serving the government.
Coast Business Radio caught up with Kate Carnell AO, the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprises Ombudsman.
My boss is small to medium or small businesses and family enterprises. The legislation says under 100 employees. So, that's about 99% of businesses.
Jamie Cook from the Independent Brewers Association says that independent breweries have suffered a 69% drop in sales because of the coronavirus.
So overnight, losing that much trade out of a small but growing business is hard to take, that's for sure.
And finally, don't forget to subscribe. Coming up next, Tim Mander.
This is the Coast Business Radio podcast.
Tim Mander has been the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and Shadow Treasurer for the LNP in Queensland since 2017. He was elected as LNP member for Everton in 2012 and has held ministerial portfolios in government. Tim is a known local identity through his prior career as a leading NRL referee and his work in the community. Tim's political objectives aim to echo his refereeing skills, to win respect, not necessarily popularity. Tim Mander, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. Good to be with you.
Okay, the pressing issue, the restrictions with COVID, coronavirus. When are we likely to see further lifting of restrictions, and what is the LNP calling for?
Well, it's a really good question, Mike, and we want to congratulate Queenslanders for playing their part in making sure that our infection rates have remained as low as they have. So it would seem that we have basically got the virus under control. Of course, we want to get ahead of ourselves, but we think it's time now to start looking ahead and working out what restrictions we can lift. It's incredibly important that this health crisis doesn't turn into an economic crisis. And of course, there are already thousands of people who have lost their jobs and businesses who are closed. So it's really important that we have a blueprint working forward where the public and business in particular can start planning for our recovery. So we think one of the first things that needs to be done is that we need to have our schools reopened so that the kids can go back there, which releases a lot of parents at the moment who have a lot of time taken up in supervising their children at home. Some of them are working from home, and that's not good for productivity. So one of the things that we can do is open up those schools, get our kids back there, release parents back into the workforce, and of course then we'd look at a progressive rollout of lifting restrictions so we can get cafes and restaurants and small business back up and running as quickly as possible.
Because Queensland is a small business state, and you mentioned the cafes and the other small businesses, what can we expect then, say, in 12 months' time? Because it's not going to be easy.
No, it's not, and business won't be the same as it was in the past. And I think this is where we've got to give credit and give an opportunity to our small business people to be innovative and nimble with regards to responding to the crisis. So social distancing principles in some form or another would seem to be have to be implemented for some time yet. So that's why it's important that businesses get some type of warning of when they'll be able to operate again, so they can start preparing for that. Who knows how long this crisis will go for until we find a cure, which could still be 6 months, 9 months off. Business won't be the same as it was in the past, and they are going to have to do things differently. But I'm really confident that they will be able to adapt. But it's important that government works with them and communicates effectively. At the moment, what's happening is that we're basically waiting with bated breath on a weekly basis. What is the tally, if you like, for want of a better word, and where, what restrictions are going to be lifted. And I don't think that's good enough. I think the government needs to have a blueprint and to publish that so that people know what's going to happen over the ensuing months.
Queensland, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, up north, world famous for tourism. Tourism has been smashed, to say the least. Now with Virgin, the fallout with Virgin, what can be done to help, say, Queensland tourism, even Virgin, because we can't just have one airline. Otherwise, we'll be paying another $500 on a $500 trip, so $1,000. It's a lot of money. So what can be done? It's I see Jackie Trad was keen to dip into her back pocket for a couple of $100 million. It's not going to do much chop, is it?
Well, Mike, you're right with regards to tourism. It's one of the pillars of the Queensland economy. We're going to be impacted more than the other states with that, whether it's the Gold Coast right up through to Cairns and the Outback as well. So, and also recognising that, realistically, there probably won't be international travel for, maybe another 12 months. So we've really got to focus on our domestic tourism industry and promoting within Australia, because they've got little options anyhow, about vacationing and holidaying at home in our own backyard. So again, we have to make that as easy as possible for businesses by cutting red tape. One of the unfortunate things at the moment is that we are the only state in the Commonwealth that hasn't offered direct grants to small businesses, which every other state has, between $10,000 and $17,500, and they really would appreciate that type of support. And the loans that the state government has offered to small business of up to $250,000 has already been oversubscribed. So those lifelines aren't there at the moment. And as you mentioned, when the government talks about giving $200 million towards an airline that is 90% foreign-owned, that's got $7 billion worth of debt, that lost $350 million last year and laid off 750 staff in Brisbane, I think small business, particularly the tourist industry, would much rather that $200 million be directed towards Queensland-owned businesses to help them up and going. So we've got to have a government that is willing to cooperate and talk and work with the tourism industry. Of course, we've got to have a promotion campaign which promotes those places in Queensland that people need to visit. But we also need to stimulate the economy by investing in infrastructure that will have a flow-on effect right around the state, whether that's the new Bradfield scheme, whether it's opening up the Galilee Basin, whether it's building the dams that are required across the state. They're the type of things that we'll be committed to, which will have a big flow-on effect.
To do business, one of the big items is energy. the cost of energy. How do we address that elephant in the room? Because it really doesn't seem to be getting a whole lot cheaper. I mean, it's hard enough doing business as it is, but when you have the high energy prices, it just makes it ever so much harder. So what would the LNP do about that?
Well, Mike, we've announced already a couple of significant policies in that space. One of them is that we have two power companies in Queensland at the moment. The Productivity Commission and the Competition Authority have both said that they have, if you like, monopoly type of powers on the industry, and they need to be broken down. So one of our policies is to break that into three. That will increase competition, and the studies done by those two bodies I've just mentioned predict that that would have a downward pressure due to the increased competition on electricity prices right across the state. But the other thing we've done, which is very significant, is that we have said that we will introduce competition in the electricity retail market in regional areas. So it's only us in the southeast corner that can get on the phone and shop around for the different energy retailers. I did that, and I saved $300 by actually just picking up the phone and making the phone call. That privilege doesn't apply to anybody outside of the southeast corner. So we are going to invest a considerable amount of money to make it viable for retailers to operate in the regional centres. And again, that will lead to hundreds of dollars of reduction for not just businesses, but for residents as well that live outside of the south. We think that they should have the same privileges in regional Queensland as we have in southeast Queensland. That's particularly important in a state that has the population dispersed as much as Queensland does.
If you win government in October, what are some of the priorities of the LNP?
Well, the biggest priorities, Mike, is that we really have to get Queensland working again. So we've announced some policies that will do that, but they take on even sort of a greater emphasis now, or even more relevant because of the crisis that we're going through. We need big, bold plans that don't look at just the next one or two election terms, but look at 40 or 50 years down the track. The new Bradfield scheme definitely falls in that category. So we have all this water every year that falls in the north. In fact, the amount of water that went over the Burdekin Falls Dam in February last year during those flooding rains could have filled Sydney Harbour in 5 hours. So for years, people have been trying to work out what can we do with that water. There was the original Bradfield scheme, which had some holes in it. And we've had two of the Knights of Industry, Sir Leo Hilscher and Sir Frank Moore, been looking at this for some time, and they came to us and said it is possible to actually make this Bradfield scheme work if we make some changes. So we will be able to store this water so that we can produce enormous amounts of hydroelectricity to power up to 800,000 homes. We can also irrigate a landmass the size of Tasmania with the water that'll be provided. We'll create thousands of jobs, and we'll also help the Great Barrier Reef by stopping the soil flow into the Great Barrier Reef because of the flooding rains. So this is an exciting prospect that Deb Frecklington has already announced, and it will be one of our key infrastructure projects. I mentioned earlier the Queensland Dam Company to build some of the dams that are required across the state. We need to build a second M1 to stop that congestion between Gold Coast and Brisbane. We need to bring in this regional electricity competition that I also mentioned. And there'll be a number of other big-ticket items that we'll announce before the election so that people can see that we have a plan to recover from this economic and health crisis. Our concern at the moment is that this government, the Labor government, will not deliver a budget. And as far as I'm concerned, if you don't deliver a budget, it means you don't have a plan for the future.
A dam seems to be a bad word in the Socialist Republic of Victoria. They were asked there for the dam. I mean, that's Alan Jones's terminology, so he'll get the royalties for this one. But however, the minister, they asked the minister, said, look, why don't we build some dams? And the minister there, I don't know who it was, anyway, she said, it's not going to rain enough. So why would you build a dam if there's no rain? And anyway, and the Weather Bureau, they said, there's going to be no rain up until May. We've had rain after rain after rain, and as you said, just in 5 hours it could have filled up Sydney Harbour. So what is the issue? I mean, I don't understand. What is the issue with dams?
I can tell you quite clearly, Mike, what the issue is. So the issue is that the radical green movement. I'm not talking about people that are genuinely concerned about the environment, which most people are, but the radical green movement have a philosophical opposition to dam building. They claim that the flooding or the stored waters destroy natural habitat and so on and so forth. But I mean, dams are a necessity for life. Water is a necessity for life, and one of the biggest issues we have in Queensland is water security. So the reason that Labor governments don't build dams is that they're concerned about the effect it has on green preference votes and green preference deals. So, if you speak to some of the right wing of the Labor Party, they understand the necessity for dams, but unfortunately the left wing of the Labor Party, which is the dominant faction in the state of Queensland and the state of Victoria, just will not go there with regards to building dams. It defies common sense. In fact, in this state at the moment, they are reducing the capacity of dams. The Paradise Dam in Bundaberg allegedly has some structural problems. In fact, it does have some structural problems. But this government is not listening to experts, which said all we need to do is spend about $25 million to strengthen that dam at Paradise, not reduce the capacity by 30%. Now, that has an enormous impact on people who have invested in growing, for example, in that region, macadamia nuts, knowing that they would have a supply of water into the future. Now, that supply is out. So it's that type of thing which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, but the LNP is very much in favour of doing that, so much so that we will establish an authority whose only objective is to make sure these dams are built, and that's what we'll do.
And finally, I've got to ask you about the M1. Which will come first, the dam or M1? And it's when I first moved to Brisbane, and people said, M1's terrible. And I actually got down one day very quickly in about 50 minutes. So I thought, this is fantastic, talking rubbish. Anyway, that was my one and only time when I lived in Brisbane. Now, the other way around, it's the same thing. It's just chockers. Even with Jeff Kennett for the Com Games, when he landed in Brisbane and drove down to check out the games and stuff, and he said, it won't happen because you'll get stuck in this car park. So the thing is, when will the M1 have something happening to it? Do we build an M2? Do we widen the road? And the other thing, while we're at it, Tim, just quickly, why do governments build freeways too small? Because they know that with population growth, it's going to be bigger. I have no idea why. Let's put 3 lanes. No, we'll put 3 in. And then within 10 years, you need 2 more lanes.
Look, well, to answer your last question first, is a lack of foresight. And one of the other issues, and this is the challenge that we have in this state, Mike, is that we have, before coronavirus, a debt heading towards $90 billion. So by far the largest debt out of all the states. So this is when it has an impact. So often people think, the debt's government debt, who cares about it? But one of the consequences of a debt that large is that it's then difficult to go and do the infrastructure projects that are necessary. So, but we've committed money already to the second M1. Some people call it the Coomera Connector, so that we can get off to 60,000 cars per day off that M1. It is diabolical, the M1, and it's an embarrassment for the major route between Brisbane and the next largest city in the state, the Gold Coast, and something has to be done about it. It also, you need to be able to cooperate. So that's a project that a state government would find very difficult to do by themselves. They need to partner with the federal government. And the Labor government here has, a history of playing politics about these funding issues rather than trying to strike a deal. I know that we would be able to work very well with the Morrison government. The Palaszczuk government hasn't got a great history in that. But to answer your question before, what will happen first? They can happen simultaneously.
Well, we hope so.
That's the type of investment that we need.
Because truly after Jeff Kennett, because Jeff's always very mild-mannered and doesn't say a whole lot, much, he was shocked. I thought, having lived in Victoria, I thought, that's the Jeff Kennett we grew up to love.
And Mike, the other thing about that, it's not just those that are commuting between, the if you like, normal citizens or workers. It's businesses, small businesses, it's trucks. That impacts the economy. When there are these delays and bottlenecks and congestion. So, you will make the businesses far more efficient if they can move far more quickly and freely between those two major centres.
Tim Mander, do you think I would have got a red card? Is that what you call it with rugby? I mean, being an AFL.
Well, it's the word that's used for sending people off. It's a soccer term, but we just point the finger in rugby league, mate. So no, you've done well. You can stay on the field.
But would they have bought me a beer after it? That's the big question.
Yes, that's true. Who knows?
Tim, thank you very much.
You're more than welcome, Mike.
To keep us all safe and to help our health workers, it's vital to know quickly if you've come in contact with someone who has tested positive for coronavirus. It's why we've introduced the COVID Safe app. With your privacy protected by law, COVID Safe keeps a secure note of other users you've been near if you have to go out. So, if they test positive for coronavirus, you'll be notified. It'll help us stop the spread sooner so we can get back to the things we love. Download COVID Safe today. Authorised by the Chief Medical Officer, Canberra.
We're talking business, nothing but talk.
This is the Coast Business Radio Podcast.
Dr. Ivan Misner is the founder of BNI, the world's largest business networking organisation. Founded in 1985, BNI has thousands of chapters throughout the world. Each year, BNI generates millions of referrals, resulting in over billions of US dollars worth of business for its members. Called the father of modern networking by CNN and one of the top networking experts by Forbes, Dr. Misner is considered to be one of the world's leading experts on business. Among his many awards, he's been named Humanitarian of the Year by the Red Cross and in 2016 was the recipient of the John C. Maxwell Leadership Award. He is also proud to be the co-founder of the BNI Charitable Foundation. Ivan Misner, thanks for joining us.
Mike, thanks so much for having me back on. I really appreciate it.
Okay, what's your thoughts on COVID-19 crisis and basically the shutdown of businesses overnight?
Yeah, so, I hate to call it the quarantine, the lockdown, the shutdown. I really have always tried to put as positive a spin on things as possible, including when I had cancer. I try to put the positive spin on it. And for me, I like to call it the great pause. We've all been forced to take a pause and to reflect and look at our business and innovate. I mean, you think about it. I run the world's largest in-person networking organization. We have 9,500 in-person meetings every week. If there is any business, I mean, that's crazy. If there is any business that could really have been decimated by this, it's certainly a business like ours. And we have, within just weeks, flipped from in-person to online. So we now have 9,500 online meetings every week all around the world. And it's been incredible.
You once said to me in a previous interview, we're talking about business, and especially now I can see this being applied. I said to you, will we ever get life balance in business? And you said, no, we'll get harmony. Is that still the case?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in harmony. I don't know if I had done the book yet, Who's in Your Room, when we talked last, but I talked about that in one of my more recent books, Who's in Your Room, about the secret to creating your best life. And in there, I talk about balance is impossible. We look at balance like scales, and that our business has to be in balance with our personal life and spiritual life, and everything has to be completely in balance. And truth is, the life is more like a juggling act and a balancing act. And so I really believe in harmony versus balance. And I do believe you can create a life of harmony. I don't believe you can create a life of balance. At least I've not found it. But I have found a life of harmony, which is managing to deal with all of the different things in your life in an effective way, but not necessarily completely in balance.
Speaking of balance, we need to have full economy, whether it's in the US or in Australia, England, anywhere in the world. And I read somewhere this morning, in fact, that says 1 in 5 Americans could soon be unemployed. So how long do you think it will take for the US and the global economy to recover?
So I really think a lot of it depends on mindset. And I mean, if you take a look at the U.S. dollar bill, I'm going to get a little U.S.-centric here for a moment. If you look at the back of the U.S. dollar, it says the words, "In God we trust." Now, forget about the spiritual element of it. But what I find interesting is that the dollar bill talks about having trust. And I think that's the key here, is that the public has to trust that they can make this up, that they can make this work. And I'm not talking about a spiritual goal here, but I am talking about confidence in the ability to turn this around. And I think the quicker we as a public, not just Americans, but global citizens, are able to trust that we can turn this around, the quicker it'll turn around. I mean, you look at the economy before COVID, and the economy was, in most places all around the world, very strong. I think we can get there again. It's going to take a few months. It's not going to happen, overnight. But I believe it will happen if people really are not set in fear. Don't be focused on fear. Be focused on opportunities. And if they do that, we can get through this in just a few months. And I think the economies will turn around. I don't see this as a long-term recession, believe it or not.
What about networking? I mean, has online commerce changed the principles of growing a business and good networking? Is it still the same? I mean, because I was talking to someone last week about this virtual world we live in. This was a lady in Hong Kong, and we're saying, it's wonderful, we can still connect, blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, it's a bit like a virtual scotch or a whiskey. It looks great, but it's not the same.
It's not the same. You're right, it's not the same. And I don't think it'll ever be completely the same. I think as technology improves, it'll get better and better. There was a report about a year ago by the vice president of development for Linden Labs, where he said mixed reality technologies will be as commonplace as the iPhone within the next 5 to 10 years, which means technologies that are like 3D or mixed reality holographic images will be very, very commonplace. And I think that will help to address this issue, but nothing as good as meeting in person. We're doing this on the internet, this interview, but I've done many interviews on the internet, and they can be very, very good, but nothing's better than sitting across a table and looking at somebody with a microphone. The only thing between us is a microphone, and having a conversation and looking each other in the eyes and shaking hands. Nothing beats that. And I do believe that is going to be important. Maybe, the millennials probably will be more comfortable with the online. And I don't know what I think the centennials are after that. I believe that those born in 2020 are going to I think they're going to be called the quarantines. I could be wrong.
Or the hibernators.
What's that?
Or the hibernators.
Hibernators, yeah. So I who knows what it is, but I think it'll become easier and easier as time goes on. But at my age, I think in person is still the best way to connect with people.
What's your advice on how to survive if you're a small business with little capital and you're doing it really tough at this very moment?
So I really believe that if you wait until tough times are over, your business will be over. I'm going to repeat that. If you wait until tough times are over, your business will be over. And so you cannot wait until tough times are over. You have to really spend time now working on your business. And this is where I believe networking is an incredibly powerful tool, because this is an opportunity for you to go deep and build relationships with the people that you have in your personal network, to connect with them and to go deep in those relationships. Because if your network is a mile wide and an inch deep, it's not a very powerful network. It needs to be both wide and in places deep. So this is your time to devote effort in building your network and activating your network, connecting with people and finding out how they're doing and be there to help them. And so I think this is the biggest complaint, Mike, that I got in the past about networking was, I don't have time to network. Yeah. Okay. You got time now. So spend that time activating your network and building relationships with people. That's my advice.
Just reaching out now, speaking about reaching out, BNI does all that and more. Tell us, this is your 60 seconds elevator pitch. Now, you have longer, by the way, but tell us about BNI from its inception to where it is now.
Well, BNI is a business and professional marketing organization that helps people build their business through referrals. We help people create lifelong referrals. And we have over 9,500 groups in more than 70 countries. We're very, very active in Australia. I created the organization because I didn't like the networks that were out there. I felt that many of them were very mercenary. Many of them were very social. I didn't like either. I wanted to have something that was relational and business oriented. And so that's why I created BNI. We now have over 270,000 members worldwide. And as I mentioned, we have flipped from in-person to online. So it's easier than ever to connect, to participate in a BNI group. You can show up at a BNI meeting and be in your sweatpants, and nobody will ever know. We're managing this because of our innovation, and that's one of the things I think businesses need to do is innovate right now.
But once these restrictions just vanish, go away, once we cross the bridge or crawl through that tunnel, hopefully the light isn't a train coming towards us, back to one-on-one. Is that how it goes?
Well, I believe a couple of things. One is I think the genie's out of the bottle, and now that we've seen that you can, in fact, have online meetings successfully, that there might be some hybrid. I'm not telling you what will happen with BNI. I don't know, but I foresee that there might be some kind of hybrid in the future of BNI, and the fact that we've had to do it has created an opportunity to do it. Many companies have been disrupted over their careers, over their businesses. I mean, Blockbuster was disrupted by Netflix, which is now global. Kodak was disrupted by digital cameras, which, oh, by the way, Kodak invented the digital camera. They had the patent on it, and they didn't pursue it.
I recall
and so
that.
I don't want to be disrupted. I want to be the disruption. Mm-hmm. So I believe that the genie's out of the bottle. But I think that we will, for the most part, go back to in-person meetings with possibly some kind of hybrid in place where there are in-person, especially as where there are online meetings, especially as technology improves. As a matter of fact, I wrote an article for entrepreneur.com. If you go to entrepreneur.com and you do a search on remote meetings of the future, you'll find an article I wrote in 2018 that said that meetings of the future will actually be online, including networking groups like BNI. But I anticipated it would be 5 to 10 years down the road. I didn't anticipate the COVID virus that obviously was a surprise to us all. You
had a pause in your life. You had cancer. Got through it. Wrote a book with the boss, the one beside you at all times, your wife. Healing Begins in the Kitchen. Tell us about the book. And I was looking at one of the videos too with John Gray, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus fame. And I'm absolutely astounded because I am a skeptic at times. Normally my healthy night out would be a couple of sliders, some fries and a margarita or four. Tell us about the book and on how it actually does work.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, thank you for mentioning my wife, Elizabeth, my bride of 31 years. And I love that you mentioned that she's beside me, because I think so many people say, they talk about the woman behind the man. And Elizabeth has never been behind me. She has always been by my side. And I am the success I am today, really in large part because of her. So I was diagnosed with cancer 8 years ago, and I was told I had 6 months to get surgery. Otherwise, it would become extremely serious and probably fatal. And I took the time. At that point, I really didn't believe in holistic medicine. I was very much a Western medicine kind of guy. And my wife kind of guided me and coached me into trying some holistic medicine for a few months before I decided what kind of surgery I would do. And over those 6 months, I was all in, completely doing the holistic approach. And over the 6 months, my markers reduced, and in the images, the MRIs and sonograms I was doing, the tumor actually reduced. And the doctor who wanted to do surgery was like, what are you doing? And I told him, he said, I can't be that. He said, all right, well, you don't have to do surgery yet. And now that was 6 months. He said, let's wait a month and let's see how it's going. And it continued to get smaller and smaller and smaller until about 9-10 months later, he said to me, well, I don't get it. You're in remission. I don't need to see you for a year. And that's when I really became a believer in holistic medicine. It has been 8 years, and I have still not done radiation, chemotherapy, or surgery. And I was told I had 6 months to do it. So I'm a believer. Healing Begins in the Kitchen is the name of the book. And it was co-written with my wife, Elizabeth.
And it's good if you're in business and you travel a lot, because you were saying in one of the videos that you would go to the chef at the restaurant or at the hotel and say, this is how I want it done.
Yeah.
And were they, I mean, on the video, you said they weren't offended, but I know some chefs, I'm just wondering if you had to wear a vest in or carry a shield or something, because some chefs, they don't like you messing with their creation.
Yeah. So that was my expectation. I totally believed that would be the case. And so I went into it unknowingly the right way. So what I would do is when I would go to hotels, first of all, Elizabeth would send a list, and it's in the book, the list of things that, I needed to eat in order to remain healthy. And so it was an advanced sheet. But then I've met more chefs over the last 8 years than I've met before the previous 28 years because they were so amazed by this menu that I had. And what I discovered was that particularly chefs at hotels, they're cooking the same stuff over and over and over again. So they're like, oh, this is really unique. I like it. And it was incredibly easy to work with chefs. Now, when I go to a restaurant, the first thing I do, this sounds crazy, but the first thing I do when I talk to the waiter or waitress is I say, okay, let me just tell you right up front, I'm a special needs child regarding food. And they laugh and they say, okay, we can work with you. What do you need? So I just calm them down a bit. And I'm not being difficult. When this happened, I was in LA and there's so many people like from California. Well, I want a double latte that's this and that and whatever. And they get really difficult. So I didn't want to be difficult with people, and I wanted to let them know up front that this is a medical diet. What I found was that people are amazingly cooperative when you tell them that. And it's been that way for the last 8 years.
You're healthy. You're living in beautiful Austin in the US, one of the great cities, one of the great culinary cities of the US. Where do you see the future for business, not just the US, but globally?
Well, I've always believed in having a positive attitude. One of the things that I posted recently is that hope is more powerful than fear. And I believe that. Hope is more powerful than fear. And hope and action can change the world. And so I have hope for business and for the world. I believe that you start with hope and you take action. And I think amazing things can lie in the future for us if we take appropriate action and we come from a perspective of hope versus fear. Because I've seen many people in fear, and I got to tell you, nothing great ever comes from fear. Fear paralyzes people. Hope gives people a focus on what can be done. And so I have great hope for the future, and I think we can make amazing changes in business in the future.
Dr. Ivan Misner, founder of BNI, chef extraordinaire, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Great talking to you.
Now more than ever, business people need to network to thrive in business. BNI provides a structured and supportive system online that focuses on freely giving and receiving business. BNI online meetings are designed to create a virtual environment in which powerful business relationships are not only continued but also developed with dozens of other qualified business professionals. Now more than ever, BNI is changing the way the world does business. Find out more at bni.com.au and visiting a BNI group near you.
You're listening to the Coast Business Radio podcast.
Gold Coast companies are among more than 200 nationwide to benefit as the federal government injects $50 million into manufacturing projects. Many Australian companies will benefit as the federal government ignites the manufacturing industry's recovery from the coronavirus crisis by tipping nearly $50 million into 220 projects right across the country. In Queensland, 543 jobs are expected to be created from a total of 40 projects. Karen Andrews is Minister for Industry, Science and Technology and the federal member for McPherson. Karen Andrews, welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Good. First of all, a great job, a very important portfolio. What do you want to achieve by the end of this term as Minister?
Look, there's a number of things, but I'm very, very clearly focused on manufacturing in Australia and making sure that in the very near future, and hopefully well before the end of this current term of Parliament, we are in a very good position to be able to roll out what the plans are going to be for Australian manufacturing over the next 5 to 10 years. Manufacturing is probably an area where there are real opportunities for us to maximise on our strengths, and of course coming through the COVID crisis has indicated a number of areas that we could be looking at. So clearly manufacturing, setting the vision for Australia and the roadmap to get there is one of my greatest priorities.
With COVID-19, the Prime Minister said there is no map. We're just going to do our very best, and so far I've got to say, Prime Minister and Greg Hunt and everybody else has done a fabulous job. When we cross the bridge, as the PM would say, and get to the other side, what we have learned is that our manufacturing industry has been not what it should be, not for the emergency that has presented itself. So what can be done about our high cost structures to compete with the rest of the world, high energy prices, and also IR?
So, look, they're the three big issues. So a lot of work was actually being done last year. I had a number of roundtables with peak organisations and some pretty significant businesses across Australia who have long had manufacturing capability here in Australia. And the view was clearly that Australia was always going to find it very difficult to compete on a cost basis. We need to start looking at how we could compete on a value basis. We are a high-wage nation, and there's been a number of factors over many years that have contributed to that. So what are the other options for us? And I think what has happened out of the COVID crisis is a very clear demonstration of where our strengths lie. So pre-COVID, we had only one manufacturer in Australia of surgical masks, and they were probably at capacity of about 7 million masks per year. They've scaled up. We've helped them. They're now at the capability of about 60 million masks a year. whilst we fast-tracked that and put a lot of support into it, it was still a serious amount of hard work to get that up and running. We've brought in a second supplier to do that. But we demonstrated some really key strengths in our ability to start producing ventilators, invasive ventilators here, and there are a number of manufacturers in Australia that were prepared, willing and able to pivot so that they could start producing those. Our capacity is clearly not in mass-produced goods. Our capacity sits with more the high-tech manufacturing. We've been able to 3D print the face shields that our health workers are going to be using. We're able to 3D print a number of the components for us. What we need to sort through is where our niches are in manufacturing and build on the strengths that we already have. Of course, industrial relations is going to be a key part of that, so we need to work on that system. We need to look at what our key inputs are, and that includes the cost of energy, which for most manufacturers is the single biggest input that they have.
Energy, it's always in the news, as Donald would say, whether it's a windmill popping up in the plant, a field near you, or there's windmills, or whether it's solar powered or other sustainable energy sources. But where do we get our energy from? Because, you know, there is a greater reliance on energy, especially with manufacturing. And if we haven't got that energy supply, then to achieve the other goals can be in jeopardy.
So there's three things that are happening there. So Angus Taylor is the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction, so he covers both of those areas. We're working to develop a technology roadmap so that we'll have a good look at what's happening with technology, looking to produce and finalise that report as soon as we can. Some of the key components of that will be alternate sources of energy. We are looking very seriously at what we can do with the gas market because that also gives us the benefit of reduced emissions as well as the lower price and greater supply guarantees. So that's a positive one for us. But there's also been a lot of work done on hydrogen, and our work is quite frankly world leading. So we will continue to do that, but I do need to manage expectations there, and that's probably a number of years away before we would be looking at an alternate such as hydrogen, but we need to keep working on that because that time will come around very quickly. So it's looking at a range of energy options, and that is quite clearly coal, gas, wind turbine, solar, now hydrogen. We've got hydro. We're looking at what the storage capacity is going to be for pump storage, which is what hydro effectively is. So there's a range of options there. Angus is putting together the roadmap on that, but it's really important that people are very aware of the cost of energy because they get their power bills and they look at it and they go, how can it be so high?
It's scary to say the least. Look, tell us about local firms extending their manufacturing activities with federal grants.
So we announced last year the Manufacturing Modernisation Fund, which was a program that was designed to assist our very broad base of manufacturing to upgrade their equipment, to look at advanced technologies and look at training their workers accordingly. So we've been announcing those projects. There's a couple of hundred right across Australia. There's three here on the Gold Coast that cover a wide range of areas. I was actually at Lena Broughton, one of our Australian fashion labels that manufactures right here on the Gold Coast. So they're one of the recipients. They're actually looking at automated cutting processes. So that it means that they will be transitioning their workers from the manual cutting to a more automated type of cutting, and that will improve their capability and their output and eliminate the waste. So that's just one example, but I don't think that many people realise that manufacturing on the Gold Coast is actually our third largest sector by output, and it contributes around about $7 billion into our city's economy. So everyone's very familiar with tourism and hospitality and, of course, construction, but manufacturing is actually right up there. We've got over 2,500 manufacturing businesses here on the coast, and we've got around about 14,000 people that work in that sector. So it is a significant sector for us here at the Gold Coast, and we need to make sure that we are supporting those businesses and helping them go from small to medium enterprises and from medium to large wherever possible.
It's amazing. The Gold Coast, it has not just beautiful beaches and when the pubs open, cold beer, it has this plethora of industry and, again, a great job for the government to actually recognise this. Now, to obtain government support, I imagine the business has to demonstrate not only financial business credentials, but also good management practices. How do they obtain this government support?
So there are a range of funding programs that are available. The best advice that I can give is to have a look at business.gov.au. A lot of the information is on there. And of course, you can go to the industry department as well, which is industry.gov.au. And of course, on the Gold Coast here, we have an Oz Industry office located up at Southport. So their job is to work with businesses and to point them in the right direction for what funding may well be available, what assistance the federal government can provide them. So there's some really good options for us here on the coast, and we want to work with all of the businesses and help them build to the next level, and in the process create more jobs for Gold Coasters, particularly so our kids can stay here on the coast and not move somewhere else.
Yeah, I was talking to a guy before, talking about beer of all things. He manufactures beer, and he was just saying that this weekend is looking good. Netflix, beer and a pizza or a barbecue. It's beautiful, always beautiful on the Gold Coast.
It is indeed, and I thought it was actually quite interesting. I mean, we went through the panic buying process that started with toilet paper, and there was no need to do that. We do manufacture toilet paper in Australia and had plenty of it. But then when people thought that isolation may well be coming their way, there was a rush at the bottle shop, so people made sure that they had good stocks of alcohol and I did think, well, that's, I suppose, a very Aussie response to the situation that they were going to find themselves in. But I've been amazed at the craft breweries that have sprung up across Australia, but particularly here on the Gold Coast. Simply amazing. A couple of my favourites, but I won't mention that because I may look like I'm biased. I won't do that at all, but there's some nice frothy places around, aren't there, Karen? Yep, there are. The great thing about the Gold Coast is it does offer lots of things to many people. And we do have the craft breweries, but we also have gin distillers that are here. And plenty of eating options as well. So it's great. Yeah, fantastic. At the moment, takeaway, but it's still all good. Karen Andrews, thank you very much. Pleasure.
If you're in business in Australia, right now you're facing one of your toughest challenges. It's not business as usual, and it's hard to know where to turn. Business Australia can help you manage your responsibilities to your employees, look after their health and well-being, and assist with strategies to maintain and sustain your business. We've been helping Australian businesses through thick and thin for 194 years, and we're here for you now. For free advice and support, visit businessaustralia.com.
You're listening to Coast Business Radio with Mike Ryan.
Senator Malcolm Roberts from Pauline Hanson's One Nation has a strong interest in economics and is also passionate about climate change data. Malcolm's climate investigations led to a deep understanding of foreign control in Australia and on disadvantages of our tax system. He believes strongly in individual initiative and responsibility to build strong economic, social and community structures. Malcolm, welcome.
Hi there, Mike. Thank you very much for having me as a guest.
Is one of the greatest stumbling blocks to economic prosperity our cost structure and energy prices?
It is one of the greatest, but it's not the greatest. I led Australia's largest underground coal mining project back in the 90s. And we developed a philosophy that was unique, and I've understood for many years now that the philosophy is what drives something. What I believe is our biggest detraction at the moment from economics, a successful economy, is the role of government. Government has no longer serving the people. Instead, government has been reversed in its roles, and the people are serving the government. We've got onerous regulations that are over the top. We've got red, green and blue tape that are choking the country. We've got a tax system that is highly destructive towards Australian businesses and Australian families. We've got, as I said, over-regulation. We've got a dearth of data, and instead we're run on opinions and guesses and lies, and I mean that sincerely, lies, literally. We're run on a lack of courage and a lack of integrity. So these things are by far the bigger picture, because government's role, I believe, Mike, is to create an environment in which people can thrive. That's where the engine room of an economy.
Are you fearful or worrisome about the, I am, COVID-19 with all these restrictions, because people in power don't like to give that power back?
I am worried to some extent, and we have been really watching that very, very closely. We've been calling the government out, and especially the state government, on that. Mike, it's really important, going back to your first question, that a virus, it spreads through human interactions. An economy and economic health and growth depends on human exchanges and interactions. So when we clamp people down by locking away the human interactions, by preventing those human interactions, we choke the economy, which is what we're seeing. What has happened is that there's been a complete reverse of what's needed. Now, I applaud the government's strong stance initially on protecting lives. That's essential. And I came out very strongly because I was worried that the government and politicians in Australia generally are worried about taking a position that may be wrong. So I said, no, there's too much risk. We have to come out hard on this. But what we have done is we've isolated the wrong people. Instead of isolating everyone, we need to isolate the right people, which is the sick people and the vulnerable people, which is what's happened in Taiwan. And Taiwan has hardly missed a beat in its economy. And Taiwan has only 6 fatalities in a population of 24 million that was under more pressure from the virus initially than was Australia. So they have done much better in protecting their population, so much better in protecting their economy and therefore their people in the future. And it's important to know that when you destroy an economy, that creates death 2 or 3 years down the road because of all kinds of pressures and stresses that manifest in the health system. So I am worried about the freedom, and governments, as you quite rightly point out, don't want to let go, but I'm also worried about the economic impacts of isolating the wrong people.
Interesting, the ANZ and also NAB are quite fearful of the future. The restrictions that were put in place are now going to damage the economy. What would you have done?
I would have, instead of just looking to Britain, which is where our medical people looked for guidance in this and a model of what an epidemic does, I would have looked around many countries, and in particular the countries in East Asia, Taiwan and Hong Kong notably, but also South Korea. And I would have done that because they have had the experience of the SARS epidemic. They're ready. And we need to recognize that Taiwan in particular, and also Hong Kong, has done a remarkable job. They've protected their people even better than we have. And I think we have to give credit to the government for eventually coming out strongly and closing our borders fairly early and looking after our people. But Taiwan, as I said a minute ago, has hardly missed a beat. South Korea is another really interesting example. South Korea got out of control early, and they recognized that. They started following down the Italian path. And then they clamped down, but they didn't clamp down on their people. They clamped down on testing, and they gave people, they trusted the people. And so South Korea very quickly got on top. And even though they had a very poor start, they quickly flattened their curve. So South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, they are the model, and they didn't take notice of the British doctors. They developed their own experience. So I would have listened and looked more widely and got many more people involved. Now, it's difficult to do that, so I've got to be careful here because, as I've said in the Senate twice now, the government has no manual for doing this.
Malcolm, I'm just wondering what's happened to business of late. Before we had the activist, and they were out there, and then you had business, they were there. It's sort of hard to distinguish who's who. I mean, look at the Business Council of Australia and other business groups with, say, pro-zero emissions, energy prices, windmills, as Donald calls it. Is this more emotional than science or good sense?
It's definitely not good sense for Australia. You raise a really important point there, Mike, because our large industry groups, the BCA, Business Council of Australia, Australian Industry Group, the Chamber, there's another one I can't think of at the moment. You can best illustrate their positions by looking at Heather Ridout, who was in charge of one of those groups some years ago during Julia Gillard's prime ministership. Heather Ridout could see the uncertainty caused by the demand for a carbon tax from the Labor and the Greens parties. So she said, what we need to do is to remove that uncertainty by bringing in a carbon tax. How absolutely stupid can you be? That, in my opinion, is a completely dishonest position. Some while later, Heather Ridout was rewarded by the Gillard government by being made a director of the Reserve Bank of Australia. A lot of this business is self-serving. So it's not just the individuals who are failing to represent industry in Australia, but they're representing, in some cases, and this gets me annoyed because so many of our large companies are foreign-owned. And the Business Council of Australia speaks for foreign-owned companies because they pay the dues, they pay the bills, they pay the piper. And that's what's wrong with the Business Council of Australia and business groups. They're run to suit a few large companies that are mostly foreign-owned. And they go against Australia's interests. And in particular, look at tax. Since 1953, and I use these words, I'm quoting from the Deputy Commissioner of Taxation in 1996 and in 2010, the same man, he retired around about 2015. His name was Jim Kalali. He said that since 1953, 90% of Australia's large companies are foreign-owned, and since 1953 have paid little or no tax. And these people want to prolong that. And that's what makes business so difficult in this country, and that's why these self-serving people are looking after the large foreign-owned companies at the cost of everyday Australians, at the cost of families, and the cost of Australian business. It makes it so much harder for Australian businesses to compete when they're behind the eight ball 30% to start with before they even turn a dollar.
Just as an example, the excise duties, truly outrageous, and it's having an effect on the microbreweries and anybody into wine production. So you're right, we really need to revisit the whole kit and caboodle, don't we?
You're absolutely right, Mike. Taxation system is the most destructive system in this country. I have three most destructive. The most destructive political force in the country is the Greens Party. The most destructive building is Australia's federal Parliament House, and by that I mean the people within, the politicians and the bureaucrats, because they've lost touch and they no longer serve the people. But the third thing is the most destructive system, and that is our taxation system. It hits the wrong people. It's very, very harsh. It's punitive. It's just cobbled together mess, and it's not at all what we need. And there are so many areas that we need to prune. And in fact, I think the best thing that we need to do is to start again from the ground up, based upon principles and a philosophy of serving the country. Now, when I first entered the Senate, I pulled Senator Matthias Cormann aside for a minute and said, Matthias, can I talk with you? And he said, sure, mate. So I said, look, when are we going to do something about tax in this country? Oh, no, too difficult. That was it. So we will continue to beat that drum, though, because tax drives all kinds of counterproductive behaviours in this country, uncompetitive behaviours with regard to our international competitiveness, and it's just an onerous impediment. But it's not just taxes. And tell me if I'm talking too much here, because I get fired up on this. It's not just taxes. It's also all the rates, the fees, the levies, the surcharges. Now, Joe Hockey, when he was Treasurer under Tony Abbott's government, he said that 50% of the tax rate for most people in Australia is 50%. And he said, in graphic terms, that means people work from January to the end of June just to pay taxes. There were figures, and I haven't been able to trace these down, I haven't put much effort into it, but I know fairly reliably there were figures, I think it was from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, that said at that time, Mike, 68% of the income from a person earning the average income, which these days is about $80,000, 68% is paid to governments in taxes, rates, fees, levies, charges, special charges. That means that we've been fed a line about the biggest cost of our life will be our house. Absolute rubbish. The biggest cost of our life is government. And that's why we continually question and hold accountable the government, because we're not getting value for money because the government is not serving us.
Interesting points. We could go on forever, and we haven't got forever, Malcolm. But just in summary of the whole thing, issues with government, issue with the taxation system, will that ever change? If
we look at the structure of politics in the last, since the 1950s, early 50s, we've had two dominating parties, the Labor Party and the Liberal Party. I look at our productive capacity in this country. It has been destroyed by subservience to foreign treaties, mainly with the United Nations. We have, in 1990, the government provided a list of 7,000 treaties that constrain us. We've lost our sovereignty. We've lost our economic sovereignty. We've lost our good governance. We've become interdependent, which is exactly what the UN wanted. But when you're interdependent, Mike, it means we're dependent on each other, which means we're dependent. Australia used to be independent once, not interdependent, independent. And we had a thriving manufacturing, a thriving primary sector, and a growing tertiary sector. We've lost that. And Australia needs to come back to being independent. And so the most important thing of all is truth and the need to understand that government's role is to serve the people, and the government best serves the people by making sure the business environment is appropriate and enables true investors, true businessmen, small, large, it doesn't matter, to serve people by meeting their needs. And government can never understand that, but business people do. In each sector, people develop enormous capacity for understanding what the market wants, and that is what we need to get back to. Creating an environment in this country that serves business, to enable business to employ people, to enable good wages, to enable security and low risk in the future. That's what we need to get back to. Independent Australia.
To keep us all safe and to help our health workers, it's vital to know quickly if you've come in contact with someone who has tested positive for coronavirus. It's why we've introduced the COVID Safe app. With your privacy protected by law, COVID Safe keeps a secure note of other users you've been near if you have to go out. So, if they test positive for coronavirus, you'll be notified. It'll help us stop the spread sooner so we can get back to the things we love. Download COVID Safe today. Authorised by the Chief Medical Officer, Canberra.
We're talking business, nothing but talk.
This is the Coast Business Radio Podcast.
Kate Carnell AO is the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprises Ombudsman and is an independent advocate for small business owners. The office has powers to influence lawmakers and ensure legislation and regulations are put in place to help small business grow. Kate, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me today.
Okay, now tell us about the importance of the role for small business and family enterprises.
My role was set up just over 4 years ago by a piece of legislation at federal government level, and it was lobbied for by the then small business minister, who believed it was really important to have an independent statutory voice for small businesses and family enterprises in the federal arena. And so the legislation, which means that I'm appointed by the Governor-General, I don't actually report to the government of the day as such, so we don't work for the government. I always say I work for small business, small business is my boss, but we've got a piece of legislation that we have to comply with. The legislation gives us two roles. One is an advocacy role, as you said, to ensure that regulation, legislation and policy is as small business friendly as possible. It gives us the capacity to do inquiries into things that are a problem for small business, things like payment times. We've done some work in that space. There are issues with bank contracts. We just recently finished a piece of work on supply chain financing, and we're doing some work on the laws around liquidation and how small business friendly they are. It's that sort of work that where there is issues that are really a problem for small businesses. So we've got that bit of what we do, and actually we've got in that space sort of mini Royal Commission powers, so we can seek documents, we can have for hearings, do those sorts of things, and then we have a more traditional role of an ombudsman, is that we can help small businesses who have got problems with big business or with government, certainly at federal level, and we work on their behalf to get justice. And they're regularly, businesses that haven't been paid, businesses that, that stuff that's been delivered to them isn't fit for purpose. There's a range of issues that we deal with. So fundamentally, as I said, my boss is small to medium or small businesses and family enterprises. The legislation says under 100 employees. So, that's about 99% of businesses in Australia, really. And I've got a small team in Canberra, a bit in Sydney, and we work very closely with industry associations, people who represent small businesses, and try to get a better deal for them.
I'm sort of picturing you at the moment, a bit like Joan of Arc, but Kate of Arc. Is that something like that anyway?
That could be true.
Because small business...
It's a bit like that at the moment, I'd have to tell you.
Well, it's a horrid time. Small business is the engine room of the economy, as you say. Do you think they're appreciated enough by government, whether it's federal, state or local?
Look, I think they're becoming much more appreciated. As I said before, small businesses are the majority of businesses in Australia. The ATO's definition of small business is businesses with under a $10 million turnover. Now, 99% of Australian businesses fall into that category. The Australian Bureau of Statistics have a definition of under 20 employees. Now, 97% fit into that category. And, of those 97% that have less than 20 employees, 75% have less than 5. So, there's a lot of businesses and they're quite small, but they employ about half of the workforce in Australia and they make up over 40% of the GDP. So you can't negate how important this sector is, in terms of economic growth, in terms of job creation, and so on. But, unfortunately, traditionally, governments have seen business as sort of amorphous. So legislation regularly doesn't talk about different sizes of business. It just has, liquidation rules are just for business. Now, there's a big difference between BHP and the local fish and chip shop. So rules that work for BHP, on the whole, are far too complex and difficult, and by the way, time-consuming for little guys. So I think where we haven't accepted, we've got it wrong generally with business, is that we haven't seen that small businesses are really very different from very large enterprises.
What are some of the issues that have emerged with the coronavirus and the current shutdown for small business?
Look, small businesses have suffered more than anyone in this space, and probably by a country mile. When you think of all the restaurants and cafes and beauticians and nail shops and people in the event space, people who support funerals and weddings, events organisers, florists, people in the hospitality space, tourists, and the people in tourism, a lot of the businesses in the areas I've just spoken about are small. And they've either been forcibly closed or ended up in a scenario where they're servicing an industry that is closed. It's not a good time to be a wedding planner, or a florist that does funerals or weddings or whatever. Now, they haven't been forced to close, but they've got no business because, we're not having weddings, or, not big events, or people who are in the tourism space. It's hard to book a trip for someone because you're not allowed to go anywhere. So right at the moment, I think the thing that's really important to remember is everyone's hurting here, but small businesses are doing it a whole heap tougher, on average than anybody else. And of course, all of the people who work in this space work for small businesses, similarly doing it incredibly tough. And And so, the challenges right now is how we ensure that there are policy settings in place that ensure as many of these businesses will be able to reopen and will have a future. And the governments generally have come up with some great policies. The JobKeeper policy that allows small businesses or businesses generally to keep their staff on during this downturn or closure is a huge positive. There are some rough edges on the policy, there's no doubt, as is inevitable in this, in these sort of really scenarios where policy is being made really, really quickly, and it has to be. But, at the end of the day, businesses can only survive if they've got business. So I think our challenge, all of us, has got to be we've got to use local. We've got to really focus now on keeping Australian businesses afloat, buying Australian made, using Australian-based businesses, Australian services. It'll be a long time until I think the world economy is opened again, so we've really got to make sure that we keep our economy working as much as is possible.
Are the banks stepping up? I mean, the Prime Minister came out and said $105 billion extra to loan to keep businesses just chugging along. Maybe I'm living on another planet, but in reality, the banks are on one planet, and I won't say which planet it is, but it's a little bit rude, and we're on another planet. Yeah. So the banks, have they actually learnt from their mistakes from a few weeks ago?
I tell you what, they're behaving a whole lot better than they would have before the Royal Commission, is my experience here. So, look, the fact is the banks have stepped up, and I've been one of the, a big critic of the banking industry generally and the way they've treated people generally, but small businesses in particular. But, they are giving their customers, whether they be individuals or small businesses, a capacity to push their loans, forward by 6 months or so not make any payments. They're not foreclosing, on loans generally because people have, lost their, or don't have any business or have lost their jobs. So, they're doing a lot. They've been part of a range of government schemes, something called the SME guarantee loans, which are cash flow loans for small businesses to help them get through the next 6 months. Plus, the federal government is underwriting those loans to 50%, so the interest rate can be significantly lower. There's some really good things happening in this space, and for people who are struggling a bit, if they haven't spoken to their bank, they should, and explain their situation. And it is my experience that mostly banks are really coming to the table. And by the way, if they don't, ring my office and we'll go and bash them up for you.
Franchising, okay, that's an important part of business. It's a huge industry around the world. It always gets whacked around the head for some reason or another. The franchising problems, are they less now than they used to be?
Probably right at this moment. No, there's a lot of franchisees that are really hurting, as you can imagine. If you think about all of the franchises that are in food courts in major shopping centres, and the food courts are closed. Or you can't sit down, you can only get takeaway. I can't quite work out why you go to a food court for takeaway, particularly. Mind you, there are delivery services and so on that are still using those. So there's a range of franchisees that are really, really, really hurting. And, of course, there's a chunk of them that aren't, that are in the takeaway food game or in the delivery space or whatever, that are doing very nicely at the moment, of course. So it's a mixed bag. But I'd have to say that generally the franchisors are behaving generally better than, again, before the major inquiries that we've had into franchising. I think there were some franchisors that their behaviour was totally unacceptable. The way they treated their franchisees wasn't in any way fair or equitable. And I think that the increased regulation in that space, the mandatory franchising code, which we administer out of my office, that requires franchisors to come to the mediation table when a franchisee has a problem, have really helped. They've really made franchisors realise they can't get away with bad behaviour. That said, right at the moment, the franchisors are hurting too.
It's a tough time, isn't it?
I think, Mike, the challenge is got to get the economy up and running as quickly as possible, while keeping in mind the issues of keeping the COVID-19 under control. But I think we need to. Every week that we don't get things reopened are another few small businesses, franchisees, and others that will really struggle to be a viable business in the future.
What would you like to achieve in your role as the Ombudsman? Say, when you decide to hang up your laptop and sit back with a shardy.
Yeah.
So what would you like?
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, that's right. And a barbecue and lobster, of course. What would you like to achieve?
When you can do that again. Look, what I'd like to achieve is I'd like to have, particularly federal government, because that's what we focused on, federal government regulation and legislation, much more appropriate for small businesses. And I'll use the industrial relations legislation as an example. The Fair Work Act is 960 sections, 250,000 words, and that's before we even start to talk about the 122 different awards that we've got. Now, that's, the retail award is for, big businesses and really little businesses. Big businesses, of course, have the options of having enterprise agreements and so on, but it's not really an option for small businesses. The system is complex is incredibly complex. And when you think most small businesses, 5 people, the person who does the wages, is the boss, who also works behind the counter or in the kitchen or whatever, is doing the wages at 11 o'clock at night. We've simply got to have a system that makes it easier for small businesses to employ, to get, to make wages correct, so that they don't end up on the wrong side of the Fair Work Commission. We've also got to make it easier for small businesses to be able to upsize and downsize much easier than the current legislation allows them to do. If we want small businesses to grow, there'll be good times and bad times. We're going through bad times at the moment, but that means you've got to be able to adjust your staff to whether it's good times or bad times. And at the moment, the current system isn't very flexible at all. So I must admit, I would like a industrial relations system that's much more appropriate for very small businesses that don't have that don't have HR sections and don't have people who do the wages for a living. I'd also like a tax system that was significantly simpler for small businesses. My experience is most small businesses really want to do the right thing, but they're working 60 hours a week plus often in their own businesses, in their businesses. Their capacity to be able to manage really, really complex requirements are very low. And I don't think we should be telling small businesses that they should be spending hours and hours and hours on this complex bureaucracy when they could be spending it with their family or in their business.
Now, if somebody wants your help or just have a chat about the lobster and the Chardonnay you're going to have when you retire...
Yeah, that's right. I'm very happy to chat about the Chardonnay. A lot of small businesses in the wine industry. We're very keen on small business.
So how do they get hold of your office or yourself?
Look, we've got a website, which is the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman, asbfeo.gov.au. You can go onto our website. If you've got a complaint, we've got an area on that website where you can put your complaint in online, but there's also a phone line which you can ring and talk to a real person. So we have real people that talk to you if you don't want to use the website. And can I just say right now, we've got on our website, we've got something called My Business Health. And what My Business Health looks at is how you keep your business healthy during this period of time, this difficult period of time. Talks about cash flow, talks about what's available from federal and state governments. But it also talks about making sure you're looking after yourself. Because, nothing could be more stressful than what's happening at the moment. People are, in small business, I ran my own small businesses for 20 years. Your staff are like your family. You've had to close, you haven't got any work for your staff. That's traumatic in itself. A business you might have put years and years and years of blood, sweat and tears into looks like it's going to, hit the skids. You don't know how that's going to work for your family. I mean, this is really stressful, but it's really important. You've just got to make sure that you look after your own mental health, that of your family, and also work with your staff to come through the other end of this. And so My Business Health looks at your health, small business health, but also your business and your personal health. Let's put it that way. And I think it's really important at this time to focus on both.
Kate Carnell AO, the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprises Ombudsman, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Now more than ever, business people need to network to thrive in business. BNI provides a structured and supportive system online that focuses on freely giving and receiving business. BNI online meetings are designed to create a virtual environment in which powerful business relationships are not only continued but also developed with dozens of other qualified business professionals. Now more than ever, BNI is changing the way the world does business. Find out more at bni.com.au and visiting a BNI group near you.
You're listening to the Coast Business Radio podcast.
The Independent Brewers Association provides a united voice for independently owned brewers across Australia. There are over 600 independently owned breweries, each one with its own unique identity. Research shows a 69% drop in sales since the coronavirus lockdown measures were implemented, which is very surprising. Jamie Cook is one of the founders of Stone & Wood and a current IBA board member. That figure, Jamie, and welcome, by the way, 69%. Who would believe?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Obviously, a day that I think will go down in history in Australia is the 23rd of March, 2020, when we were forced to shut pubs and hospitality venues around the country. And, for a lot of the IBA members, who are all small brewers in this country, they rely very heavily on on-premise sales. In other words, sales of draft beer and packaged beer into pubs, restaurants, cafes, etc. And to lose that customer base overnight really ripped, probably half of their sales straight out of their hands. And then obviously a lot of the small breweries also run and operate their own tap rooms or cellar-door operations and bars within their breweries, and obviously they had to close those as well. So, and that provides quite a strong cash flow for a small brewer. Overnight, losing that much trade out of a small but growing business is hard to take, that's for sure.
How do you get by? Are the banks supportive?
Yeah, look, I think obviously the banks are all being quite supportive of small business at the moment, as are obviously the government, federal government, with its job seeker and job keeper programs have helped out. A lot of our small businesses are culturally very people oriented and therefore want to keep their employees on as much as they can. A lot of them had to cut back wages or cut back hours worked, etc. But what they're trying to do is keep most of their permanent staff on. Some of the casuals they've had to let go in their hospitality venues. The government, through their JobKeeper and Job Seeker, but also through deferment of excise payments. So one of the things they did quite early in the piece was allow brewers and small alcohol producers to defer our excise payments. We pay excise weekly for all beer that's left the brewery the week before, well before we get paid normally. From our customers. So it's an impediment on cash flow. So deferring that for a few months has certainly helped manage cash, but it's still a big impost, and it's just moving the problem down the road a few months. And at some point there'll be a tax bill there where everyone will have to pay.
Which states have been hit the hardest by the drop in sales? I was going to say Northern Territory, because they're very thirsty young men up there and women. But is it a national trend, or are there states that really stand out?
No, it's around the country, unilaterally around the country. I mean, basically, every hospitality venue in the country closed as of that 23rd of March. And therefore, for most of the small brewers, that represented more than half of our business. So it was a big kick in the shins. 600
microbreweries or craft breweries, independent brewers. 600 is a lot, but all of those, because I was shocked at the cost to run not a hobby but a lifestyle, because it's very expensive, isn't it, to run a brewery?
It's capital intensive industry. Certainly, you need to invest a lot in plant and equipment to get up and running, and then it's quite it's capital intensive in terms of your growth. So if you are fortunate enough to be growing rapidly, you're investing a whole lot of money back in plant and equipment to keep up with that capacity expansion. So it's very capital intensive, and on a small scale. I always say that as small brewers we're magnificently inefficient because it takes, we're only about 6.5% of the volume of beer sold in Australia in those 600 small breweries, but we represent nearly half of the workers in the industry. So we certainly employ a lot of people, even though we're a quite small part of the total beer market.
I'm always surprised at the cost of alcohol in Australia compared to that of, say, the rest of the world. And we have friends who run microbreweries or small breweries, and they say that one word starts with an E. It's called excise. Is that the killer?
It's certainly an impost. And it's there. It's obviously it's a taxation that should be in place, I guess. But how it's actually implemented is certainly has an impact on small businesses. As I said earlier, the cash flow impost of paying excise before you get paid by your customers, and excise runs at about 20% of the wholesale price of beer sold from brewers to pubs, bars, bottle shops, etc. And it's about 40% of our overall cost of goods. It's one of the biggest cost lines in any production of any brewery, regardless of size. So first of all, you're paying the government on excise that you're not collecting from your customers on day one, and probably some 45 days down the road, you're actually getting paid from your customers for that. So that's a big cash flow impost. The second piece is, the amount of tax we pay is very high, proportionate to other countries. Tax on beer is very high around versus the rest of the world. And it's indexed to CPI, which means that every 6 months when there's a CPI review, the excise rate is increased. So we get beer goes up twice a year just due to the increase on excise. Even though people are drinking less beer in the country, they're drinking better beer, we're paying a higher rate of tax. So it just doesn't seem like a level of taxation that's probably pitched at a nation of beer drinkers that are becoming more sophisticated and more responsible.
Where do you see the industry once we, as the Prime Minister says, cross the bridge, hopefully with the beer in our hand, but where do you see the industry once we get through this? Hopefully on the road to recovery. The big thing that the industry is looking for is obviously the reopening of those hospitality venues. The moment that happens, that will open the gates, so to speak, and just imagine that first taste of that first schooner in a reopened pub. How good is that going to be? It's always good.
And I think that's the first thing is get some beer back out running through those venues, and we feel our customers out there are hurting just as much as we are. They've had 100% of their revenue just about cut off. So they need to be up and running again as soon as possible. Obviously, take into account that we manage the overall health of the nation at the same time. But the quicker we can get up and running and have those kegs being sold out into pubs and bars and restaurants again, and open our tap rooms, that will put cash back in the cash registers of the 600 breweries around the country, and we'll start to see some regrowth again. An industry that's been growing at around about 20% year on year over the last 5 years, on average. And we've been gearing up for that ongoing growth. To hit a wall like this has certainly hurt us. But we'll reset our base, and hopefully, with a bit more help from the government in terms of getting some more relief on that excise bill that's sitting down the road in a few months' time, we can actually, get back up and running again.
We're talking business, nothing but talk.
This is the Coast Business Radio Podcast.